Think about stories passed down through families, those whispered histories that sometimes, well, they can feel more like myth than actual fact.
Uh-huh.
What happens when science suddenly steps in and says, hang on, there might actually be something real here?
Right.
We're actually plunging into a case just like that today.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at the Picuris Pueblo people of New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
For generations, their oral traditions, their stories have spoken of this really deep connection to ancient Pueblo sites way off to the northwest,
Yeah.
especially Chaco Canyon. That's what, 275 kilometers away?
Yeah, quite a distance. And what's so fascinating here, I think, is how modern science is letting us explore these really long-held narratives in a completely new way.
Totally.
So our mission, kind of in this deep dive, is to unpack a study that just came out in Nature. And this isn't just, another archaeological report.
No.
It's actually the result of a pretty significant collaboration between the Picuris Pueblo themselves and scientists, using DNA analysis to dig into their ancestry.
And just for context, Chaco Canyon, this place was incredible. A huge regional network, over 200 really impressive great house communities.
Yeah.
Flourished for about 300 years, starting around 850 CE, give or take.
Major
Definitely.
Yeah.
And the stories of where its people went after it declined, around 1150 CE, that's always been a bit of a puzzle.
Right.
Craig Quancello, he's the Picuris Pueblo lieutenant governor and actually a co-author on this Nature paper.
Mm-hmm.
He spoke so powerfully about how finding this maternal genetic link to Chaco Canyon, seeing it there on paper, it just validates what their elders have always known.
You can really feel the emotional weight of that, can't you? That confirmation.
Absolutely.
And what's really interesting is why this study even started.
What?
Apparently, Picuris officials felt their concerns about potential oil and gas drilling near Chaco Canyon. They felt they just weren't being heard, weren't being taken seriously.
So they wanted proof.
Exactly. They sought out solid scientific evidence to back up their ancestral claims to that land, which led them to Eski Willerslev.
The geneticist.
Yeah, a top evolutionary geneticist at the University of Copenhagen. He's got a really strong track record with ancient North American DNA. They specifically went to him for that scientific foundation.
Wow. So, okay, for our deep dive today, we've got some great stuff to work with. We'll be looking at bits from news articles covering this really important nature study.
Right.
And, even more crucial, pieces directly from the study itself. It's called Picuris Pueblo, Oral History and Genomics Reveal Continuity in U.S. Southwest.
A very direct title.
It is. Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts then. How did this partnership actually get started?
Yeah.
Between the Pueblo and the scientists? And, what methods did they actually use?
Yeah, this is where it gets really compelling, I think. The study was started by the Picuris Pueblo.
Okay, that's huge.
Think about that. The community itself drove the research, which is, well, it's a real departure from how these kinds of things often happen in the past,
Yeah.
where scientists just took the lead.
Right, the old model.
The Pueblo had a very clear goal. Could DNA analysis actually support their oral history about where they came from? They knew about DNA being used in, criminal cases and ancestry testing.
Yeah, it gets everywhere now.
Exactly. And they saw the potential for their own history.
That's a really powerful shift, isn't it? The community deciding, okay, let's use this scientific lens to look at our own past.
It really is. And what followed was this extensive, 2-year discussion process.
2 years.
Yeah, between the Picuris Pueblo and the University of Copenhagen. This wasn't quick. It was all about building trust, establishing a research plan everyone agreed on.
That collaborative groundwork feels absolutely critical here.
Totally vital for understanding the weight of the findings, yeah.
So when they finally got down to the actual lab work,
Yeah.
what kind of samples were they looking at? We know DNA was the key, but where did it come from?
Okay, so the core of it was analyzing ancient DNA. They got this from the remains of 16 individuals.
Okay.
Were buried right there at Picuris Pueblo, sometime between 700 and 500 years ago.
Wow, that's old.
Definitely. Then, for comparison, they collected blood samples from 13 living members of the Picuris tribe today.
Okay, ancient and modern from Picuris.
Right. And beyond that, they folded in existing genetic data from other ancient and modern populations across Siberia, the Americas, and, crucially, including individuals who lived in Pueblo Bonito.
In Chaco Canyon.
Exactly, in Chaco Canyon. And it's worth noting, these ancient Picuris remains, they had actually been excavated way back in the 1960s.
Oh, right.
And were on long-term loan to Southern Methodist University before being transferred for this specific study.
So a fascinating kind of coming together of remains from the past and the genetics of people living right now.
Precisely.
And it wasn't just the scientists listed on the Nature paper, was it? You mentioned the Pueblo was really involved in the authorship, too.
Absolutely. The paper actually lists several members of the Picuris Pueblo government, including their current governor, as co-authors.
That really drives it home.
It really emphasizes that this was Pueblo-driven research, from start to finish. And furthermore, the whole thing was ethically reviewed, not just by the Picuris Pueblo Tribal Council,
Right.
but also by the National Committee on Health Research Ethics over in Denmark.
Right, where Willerslev is based.
Exactly. And they even had a formal memorandum of agreement, making sure Picuris Pueblo kept complete control over their genetic data.
That focus on control, on sovereignty, that feels incredibly important, especially given the, let's say, checkered history sometimes of scientific research with indigenous communities.
It's fundamental, absolutely.
All right, so they've laid this careful groundwork. They've analyzed the samples. What were the big genetic discoveries? What did they find?
Okay, the headline finding, really, is the very close genetic relationship they found between those ancient Picuris individuals and the modern Picuris people.
Okay, continuity.
Yes, strong continuity. And this included clear evidence of descent from a maternal line, a lineage, originating back in Chaco Canyon.
Wow. So directly from Chaco.
The Nature study puts it very powerfully. It says, and I'm quoting here, "No other sampled population, ancient or present day, is more closely related to ancestral Puebloans from Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon than the Picuris individuals are."
That is incredibly direct. A really strong statement.
It is. Extremely compelling.
So that's basically direct scientific backup for the oral histories linking them back to Chaco Canyon.
Precisely. And what this does is it challenges some earlier ideas, theories that maybe suggested a kind of complete abandonment of the Chaco region around 1150 CE.
Right, like everyone just left.
Yeah, with the ancestors of Picuris and other Pueblos maybe arriving in the Rio Grande area much later, this genetic evidence points strongly towards continuity, towards people staying.
A continuity of population in that Picuris lineage, specifically.
Exactly.
And it wasn't only about the Chaco connection, right? They also learned things about the population history of Picuris itself over time.
Yes, definitely. The study provided evidence suggesting a relatively stable population there at Picuris after the big Chaco settlements weren't the main hubs anymore.
Okay.
They estimate maybe around 3,000 people.
Wow, that's a decent size.
It is. And this stability seems supported by the patterns of inherited gene variants they saw in the ancient remains.
Interesting.
They also managed to pinpoint when Athabascan DNA first appears in the Picuris remains.
Oh, yeah. When was that?
Only after 1535 CE.
Okay, that's a pretty specific timeline. So the genetic data suggests that the arrival of groups like, say, the Navajo and Apache in the Southwest, that happened later than some theories used to propose.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. And it actually lines up pretty well with some archaeological findings. Like, there's a Navajo-affiliated site dated to around 1541 CE.
Okay, so it fits.
It seems to, and the study also, well, it revealed a really dramatic population decline in Picuris. Yeah, something like 85% after Spanish colonial rule began in the mid-1500s.
85%. That's staggering.
It really is a very stark contrast to their current population, which is just over 300 people.
Wow. That really brings home the just devastating impact of colonization on these communities.
It absolutely does.
Now, maybe let's step back a bit. How does this Picuris study fit into the kind of broader picture, the wider genetic history of the Americas?
Well, looking bigger picture, this study places the Picuris people within what geneticists call the southern group of indigenous populations in the Americas. That's based on their overall genomic history.
Okay.
But interestingly, their analysis also hinted at something else. A separate ancestral branch, possibly as old as the Clovis culture?
Clovis. Wow, that's way back, one of the earliest known cultures in North America.
Exactly. But the specific population linked to that really ancient lineage. Well, that's still unknown. A bit of a mystery there.
Feel like a ghost population or an ancient genetic echo we haven't fully traced yet?
Something like that, yeah. Another really intriguing detail, they found a very rare mitochondrial haplotype. That's genetic info passed down the maternal line, remember?
Right.
It's called B2Y1. They found this rare type in one modern Picuris individual.
Okay. And the significance?
The significance is that this exact same rare haplotype, B2Y1, had previously been found in, get this, elite burials back in Pueblo Bonito.
In Chaco Canyon?
In Chaco Canyon, yes.
Wow. That's a very specific marker to find in both places. That really nails down that connection, doesn't it?
It's a very strong piece of evidence, absolutely. Bolsters that link significantly.
So does this mean Picuris Pueblo is the only group with ties to Chaco?
Um,
How should we interpret that?
no, and that's really important to clarify. This study definitely does not disprove the claims of other Pueblo tribes.
Yep.
Many other Pueblo communities have their own oral traditions, their own histories, linking them to Chaco Canyon.
Right, they just haven't had this specific kind of genetic study done
Yeah.
yet.
Exactly. These other claims haven't been genetically tested in the same way, at least not published like this. So this study is specifically about the Picuris lineage and their connection, which it strongly supports.
Got it. It really sounds like the whole field, studying ancient DNA and how it relates to indigenous history, it seems to be undergoing a pretty major transformation, especially in how researchers interact with communities themselves.
Oh, absolutely. There's been a definite significant shift towards genuine collaboration.
What's driving that, do you think?
Well, it's partly driven by indigenous groups themselves, insisting on repatriation, the reburial of ancestral remains.
Right, AGPRA and similar efforts.
Exactly. Legislation like the 1990 federal law on repatriation played a big role. It's really pushed researchers to engage directly with tribes, respecting their sovereignty, their wishes.
Which is a huge shift from the past.
A major shift from, times when archaeologists or anthropologists might have acted without consent or without meaningful input from the communities whose ancestors they were studying.
We even heard from archaeologist David Hurst Thomas. He called this Picuris investigation a landmark project. What was it that made it stand out so much for him?
I think Thomas really highlighted the crucial fact that the Picuris people themselves initiated this research.
Right, they were in the driver's seat.
They weren't just passive subjects, they were the driving force. They maintained control over who participated and ultimately over the publication of the findings. It's huge.
Yeah.
He also offered an interesting interpretation of the history, suggesting that maybe communities like Picuris intentionally moved away from those big centralized settlements at Chaco around 1200 CE.
Why?
Well, perhaps preferring smaller, more independent social structures, maybe avoiding that kind of centralized political system that Chaco might have represented.
Huh. That's a fascinating perspective on maybe why those larger centers emptied out or changed. A choice, not just a collapse.
Possibly, yeah. Adds another layer.
We also heard from Brian Vallo, right, from Como Pueblo and the Chaco Heritage Tribal Association. He brought up concerns about what's happening near Chaco today.
Yes, Vallo really emphasized how vital these ancestral connections are for preserving indigenous culture. And he voiced strong concerns about the ongoing threats from drilling and mining near the Chaco landscape.
So this study adds weight to those concerns.
It provides another layer of scientific evidence demonstrating those deep, enduring ties that tribes like Picuris feel to that place.
And finally, the study also touched on the relationship between Picuris and the southern Athabascan groups, like the Navajo and Apache. What did the genetics show there?
Yeah, that was interesting too. The genetic analysis suggests that southern Athabascans, well, they can be modeled as having received a significant chunk of their ancestry from a Puebloan source.
Okay.
Specifically, a source related to the ancient Picuris Pueblo people, alongside their northern Athabascan roots.
And does that fit with other evidence?
It seems to align quite well, actually, with southern Athabascan oral traditions, with the known Puebloan origins of some of their clan names, even with loanwords from Puebloan languages found in Athabascan languages.
What?
And also the fact that they adopted agriculture after arriving in the Southwest, likely influenced by their Pueblo neighbors.
So it's all kind of interconnected then. Even the arrival and cultural shifts of other major groups in the region seem to have this genetic link back, in part, to the Picuris people.
It paints a much more complex and interwoven picture of the past, yeah.
This really just underscores the profound importance of this kind of indigenous-led research, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's just so important to keep reiterating that this study was conceived of, initiated, and directed by the Picuris Pueblo.
They held the reins.
They maintained complete authority over every stage, who participated, how the data was used, the final publication. It sets a really crucial precedent, I think, for respecting indigenous sovereignty and beliefs in genetic research.
A much-needed precedent.
And definitely a welcome departure from some historical norms in the field.
It really highlights the power, doesn't it, of bringing together these different ways of knowing. You've got the oral tradition, the archaeology, ethnography, and now this cutting-edge genetics.
Yeah.
And together, they create a much richer, more nuanced understanding of indigenous history than any one method could alone.
Exactly. Ultimately, this research just stands as a really powerful example of what can actually be achieved through true collaboration, between indigenous communities and the scientific world.
Yeah,
It offers a real sense of hope, I think, that these kinds of partnerships will lead to, well, greater respect for oral histories, for one,
literally.
more informed decision-making when it comes to issues affecting tribal sovereignty, and just a strengthening of community identity overall.
So, wrapping up, for me, some real aha moments in this deep dive. First, just that powerful scientific confirmation. The validation of the Picuris Pueblo's long-held stories connecting them to Chaco Canyon through this DNA evidence.
Yeah, that's huge.
Second, the evidence suggesting that continuity, that people didn't just disappear, but the Picuris lineage carried on after Chaco's main era.
Right, population stability there.
And finally, just the model itself, this incredible example of collaboration and respect that defined the whole research project, that feels so significant.
Totally. And what's truly significant beyond the specific findings, I think, is how this study really shifts the power dynamic in research itself.
How so?
It just demonstrates how indigenous communities can actually take the lead in exploring their own past, using scientific tools on their own terms to amplify their voices and their knowledge
Right.
in a field that, let's be honest, has too often been marked by controversy, by a lack of consultation, by researchers imposing their own narratives.
It's a really, really inspiring example.
Yeah.
And, well, that brings us to our final thought for you, the listener.
Mm-hmm.
Just consider the profound implications of a study like this. How does it change how we might understand the relationship between oral traditions and scientific evidence?
Yeah. What does it mean when they align so closely?
And maybe more broadly,
Hmm.
how might collaborative research models like this one empower other indigenous communities, around the world in reclaiming and protecting their heritage?
What other stories held within those rich oral traditions globally might be illuminated, might be understood differently through similar kinds of respectful scientific partnerships?
It's definitely a lot to think about.